So I'm here to introduce Gill, who is a fellow emerita here at Newnham, a former lecturer, director of studies, and vice principal. Her research looks at the social and political history of education and of women in particular. And some of her recent books include Faith, Duty, and the Power of Mind, The Cloughs and Their Circle from 2006, and In Search of the New Woman, Middle-Class Women and Work in Britain, 1870 to 1914 from 2015. And she recently worked with Kate Williams to edit and compile the second Newnham anthology. If any of you have copies of the anthology that you would like signed, or you would like to buy a copy of the anthology, we're going to be heading to the Porter's Lodge afterwards, where you can purchase one of those or get yours signed. And I think I will hand over to you then.
Many thanks, Lucy. What gives me, I'm not sure the right is the right word, but never mind. Why should I feel I could look at a perspective of 150 years? As you just heard, I was the principal editor and compiler of the second Newnham anthology, Walking on the Grass, Dancing in the Corridors, Newnham at 150. And there are copies, as you also heard. And earlier, I wrote about the Cloughs, the Sidgwick, and most of the first century of their particular creation, this institution, in Faith, Duty, and the Power of Mind. That's the title that gives you the themes, and the subtitle tells you what it's actually about. The Cloughs and Their Circle, 1820 to 1960. And there are copies of that, I think, also at the Porter's Lodge. And that's a paperback. Cheaper here than in Heifers. Now, then, let me attempt this perspective. In the half hour I've been told I should have, and then there will be time for some questions. Many of you will know about the beginnings, the rented house in Regent Street overlooking Parker's Piece. That drawing is the only image we have. Subsequently, it turned into a hotel, which had, for a spell, a rather dubious reputation. And then, in 1971, certain fellows of the college had to be persuaded not to make a pilgrimage there. But then the hotel burnt down, and it's been completely rebuilt, and so, it looks nothing like that anymore. But that rented house housed Anne Jemima Clough and the first 5 students. There they are, looking, as in most Victorian photographs, very solemn indeed. On the back of the jacket of Walking on the Grass, we put a quotation from a letter of Henry Sidgwick's in 1873. I quote, "If anyone should call and ask your advice as to a philanthropic investment of £4,000, please refer him to me." There we are. And this well conveys, I think, the fragility of the situation in these early years. How might this small domestic enterprise, looking more like a school than anything else, become an established institution for the higher education of women? Now, physically, you can track the moves and the sequence of buildings in the timeline with the images that Frida Midgley, our archivist, and Laura, our curator of valuable possessions, have constructed in the library area. And do look at that, and you will see some of the same images again. But in my limited time today, what I'm going to do instead is try to pick out what, for me anyway, are 4 key elements in the transformation. One's actually very difficult to capture in individual images or in the individual passages of the anthology, which are really snapshots of particular periods in time, particular episodes sometimes. But themes that are worth thinking about over the longer term and run to complement the material you have from the pictures and from the recollections. The 4 that I will pick out are the steadily growing demand from young women for a higher education, a demand which persists. Nobody quite understands why sometimes. No shortage of sage financial advice, the bulk of it coming certainly in the early years from the women members of the group, and I'll come back to that. I will come back to all 4 of these. Third, Newnham was the earliest of the UK women's colleges to secure a charter and statutes. Now, that may sound very boring. Actually, what it meant and means is that Newnham asserted itself as a self-governing academic institution, just like the men's colleges of Oxford and Cambridge. And my 4th strand is that in the process, the institution, or the fledgling institution, drew on these strengths, continues to draw on these strengths, to allow it to weather successive rebuffs from the University of Cambridge. And when at last full membership of the university was conceded, to work to become not simply in Cambridge, a fact of geography, but of Cambridge. Let's talk a little bit more about each of these. First of all, the demand. It grew, and it grew. It sustained them through these first years, emboldening them to build their first accommodation, the building we now know as Old Hall. I always think of this as the Wuthering Heights photograph, isolated from everywhere. We don't have sheep any longer, but and St. John's, who had given them a building lease, had a plan B in case the enterprise failed. It was going to become 2 gentlemen's residences. However, the demand for places continued on the up. So their second building, and you will find this on the timeline, was North Hall, first of all, later rechristened as Sidgwick Hall. Then the third and the biggest of the buildings of this period, you know as Clough. And in thinking about this, identifying the planning process, Henry Sidgwick wrote to a friend in May 1885 that, quote, Miss Clough, whose mind is always peculiarly open to the logic of facts. She was notorious for having 5 ideas, and one of them would usually fly. Has yielded to the pressure of applications and set her thoughts towards a third hall. And as ce qu'elle veut fortement, I expect we shall begin building in about 2 years. And he wasn't far wrong. I know the date in the dining hall ceiling says 1887. Actually, they didn't finish till 1888. This is builders. Then at the end of World War I, the then principal of Newnham, Catherine Stephen, told the Royal Commission on Oxford and Cambridge that the number and quality of applicants to Cambridge, from the women applicants to Cambridge, already made the case for a third women's college. They just didn't dare to found it because they were still not full members of the university. This rising demand from women for a tertiary education is marked particularly as a national phenomenon in the decades after World War II. And indeed, we are now here in Newnham's latest contribution to the provision for women. My second strand was financial management. The need for this, of course, was and is constant. It's been something of a truism in the historical literature to claim that in the UK, fewer women controlled and control still serious money than in the United States. And this argument is usually trotted out to account for the proliferation of colleges for women in the 19th century United States. The picture, I think, is more complex and nuanced than this. And I'll pick out just two elements now of particular importance in the early years. First, in these early years, Newnham had excellent advice and strategic guidance for the first 50 years of its existence. Now, a major figure at the very beginning, the negotiations that created the Cambridge Committee and saw them through the building of Old Hall, was Mary Ewart, only child of the Liverpool ship owner, and yes, he did carry slaves, but who as an MP piloted the first legislation for public libraries in the UK. A classic illustration of the mix of issues and strands that those of our students who have been working on legacies of enslavement came to encounter. Mary inherited money from slave trading, exceptional in the period as a woman controlling money on that scale, and she knew how to manage it. So a loan secured by a mortgage on the building ensured that the work to construct Old Hall could go ahead, and even though, of course, the builders didn't finish, so Aunt Jemima moved into Egremont, it was there to accommodate students. But Mary Ewart and a former bursar, Mike Payne, used to have that photograph in his office to remind him of what he was really here for. But Mary worried because she wasn't resident in Cambridge and she didn't intend to move. And when in 1876, Henry Sidgwick's new wife, Eleanor, née Balfour, who had already been teaching mathematics in the college, agreed to take on the treasurership, Mary recognized a kindred spirit and happily proposed a more subordinate role for herself. She didn't disengage completely, but she moved to the background. Eleanor Sidgwick, and so far as I'm aware, the portrait we have of her in Clough Hall in the grey dress is the only portrait that exists. I mean, a very reticent lady, but we do have some photographs. Eleanor had managed the considerable land and financial resources of her family, the Balfour family, through her mother's long widowhood. And all that knowledge and those skills were bent to support Newnham from 1876 until 1920. She actually continued in the treasurership after standing down as principal. Nora thought long. She bought land. She understood about mortgages. As the second principal of the college from 1892, she led the decision of the college council to buy the freehold of the college's site from St. John's College in 1900. It's a crucial statement of self-confidence after the university's rebuff to one of the women's attempts to become recognized in 1897, one I'll come back to. Another strand that I think is worth commenting on, apart from the importance of these early women, is the loyalty of the alumni. The pattern of giving in a women's college seems to be distinctive. In a men's college, erstwhile men's college, a small proportion of alumni donate, and the successes, the big money, tends to come from a handful who've made it big in their lifetimes. A large named gift can be an assertion of success, particularly to peers. In a women's college, a far higher proportion of the alumni donate during lifetime, but usually small sums bestowed prudently. The big sums come in the bequests from those same alumni. Structures of government, my third strand. Like all the women's colleges but one, Newnham began as a limited not-for-profit company. College lecturers, as appointed, were employees of the company, although they had representation on the council, which ran the company. By the Edwardian period, the college lecturers and alumni were a formidable bunch, both. First research fellowships had been established, which in the early years people had thought might be an extravagance, but the teaching staff had a salary structure and pension entitlement. And in 1907, the principle of paid sabbatical leave for teaching staff had been established. And in parallel with these shifts, the question began to be asked, why wasn't the college a self-governing academic community, just like the men's colleges? It was raised both by the old Students' Club, the organization which was the predecessor of the Row, which had got going as early as 1881, and by the associates who had formed themselves as a ginger group within the old Students' Club in 1893. Within the group of Newnham lecturers, the main protagonist of the idea was the classicist Jane Harrison. And I know you've all seen Augustus John, possibly ad nauseum, and Mary included the drawing of Jane in extreme old age in her lecture the other week. I thought you might quite like this image, which I think is the only one we have, of Jane as a student. Jane, however, was not an administrator, never was. So the person who actually made the idea happen was Blanche Athena Clough, Aunt Jemima's niece, daughter of her brother, the poet, though he named her, but he never saw her, and Aunt Jemima's niece, vice principal, who had turned down the principal in 1911, propelling Catherine Stephen forward, eventually only agreeing to become principal herself in 1920, and it was Jane who propelled her hard from behind then. Blanche Athena was an administrator of genius. She always maintained she was not a scholar, though her reading is extraordinarily wide. But I always think of her existence as rather clear evidence of the need for all academic institutions to have not only scholarship, but competent administration. And there's Blanche Athena, not in the very solemn Nicholson portrait, which is a bit gloomy, but in the much more agreeable, to my mind, drawing, the Rothenstein drawing from 1928. The process of securing a charter and statutes, dissolving the limited not-for-profit company, took 5 years, from 1912 to 1917. Obviously, the outbreak of the First World War did not help. And in this process, they were mindful, how could they not be, that they were still not members, full members of the university. The steps were taken to include in the college council, in the very first council, in the charter, and subsequently, representative male members of the university. They had had a cadre of support all along, and that provision remained until the beginning of the 1950s. Newnham was the first women's college in the country to assert itself as a self-governing academic institution. Girton didn't begin to take parallel steps till a decade later, and the process was not complete amongst the Oxford women's colleges until after World War II. You may say, well, all right, so do these organizational changes matter? I'd argue that they do, because it's a manifestation of determination, of self-confidence, both of which they needed to face yet another rebuff from the university. Let's backtrack for a moment. In 1881, the women had secured the right of access to university examinations and a separate class list. That's really what Commem started as celebrating. Many then thought it was but a short step to acceptance as full membership of the university, and that would come quite quickly. Not only access to degrees, but involvement in university governance. That's a crucial aspect of membership. The first formal attempt to petition for this came between 1896 and 7. And they got a rude shock. It was violently rejected. Non-resident members turned up in their droves. Special trains were laid on to vote against. There were riotous scenes outside the Senate House, and the celebrating male undergraduates penned temporarily behind the railings, then turned to do thousands of pounds worth of damage to the market and its stalls. The university hastened to compensate them. A second try to secure full membership was made at the end of World War I. It was finally defeated on the night of the 20th of October, 1921, when the celebrating undergraduates did come as far as Newnham. It was pitch dark, so we don't have any photographs of that evening, just desperate accounts of people creeping round in the darkness, the police, the special constables. On that occasion, again, thousands of pounds worth of damage were done, most notably, as you'll all know, I think, to the bronze gates at the head of Newnham Walk, the memorial to Aunt Jemima Clough. And that's the image of those gates the morning after. Newnham was already 50 years old in 1921. But the college remained trapped on the threshold of the university, as it were, another 27 years, till Cambridge in 1947-8 finally admitted women to full membership. the last university in the UK to do it. Well, what of the fourth strand I identified? Becoming of Cambridge rather than just happening to be cited in Cambridge. Formal acceptance had taken over 3/4 of a century to secure. How then was the institution to grow and to integrate? This, I think, is a key subtext. You won't always spot it, though once you start looking, you keep finding it, of much of the material which we gathered for the second anthology, Walking on the Grass, Dancing in the Corridors. How should the institution shape its own style, its personality, without treating gender as a ground for an apology or an all-embracing explanation for its existence, needing no other? If you like, it's summed up somewhat crudely, but nevertheless, in Annabel Arden's piece, has Newnham really become cool? I leave you to think about that for yourselves. I cherish the moment when I was walking past the garden tables of the Iris Cafe one morning, and I met a graduate student from another college, a grandson of an old friend. He was having his breakfast there. "What are you doing here?" he said. It was rather good to reply, "This is my college." Thank you. Now, as I said, I'm happy to take questions.
I've always been appalled at this idea that it was the last university to treat women as equals. In what happened in that period? Was there a significant fall in women applying? Because, I would have thought if any other university will give you a degree, why would you come?
No, there wasn't. Status, to a degree, counterbalanced, though certainly the women women academic medics in both Oxford and Cambridge took the view that any women they admitted to do preclinical medicine had to be twice as good as the men, because they would have to survive the clinical training as well. And while the medical schools had been forced by government to admit women to the clinical courses, that was beyond the royal free in the First World War, this was honoured more often in the breach than in the observance, and certainly the women they let in, they treated very badly. So you had to be extra tough to survive. But the compromise of the university statutes of 1926 allowed some degree, this is part of being trapped on the threshold, 12 women were appointed to university lectureships. Couldn't lecture in full academic dress. And Newnham and Girton had a joint meeting to decide what ladies would lecture in, and they decided they would lecture in hats. I actually knew the last woman who lectured in a hat, and a very stylish hat it was. But so they were there, they were exposed, their library access, university library access was enhanced. And of course, the marker went down in 1938 when the individual elected to the Disney Chair of Archaeology was Dorothy Garrod, after whom this building is named, a woman. So they knew they had to face it at war's end, if not before. But a very tricky situation, and some of the women academics stayed, A number of them went. Eileen Power, the economic historian, said she was just fed up. She went off to the LSE. A number of the scientists went to the United States. Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin would be an illustration of that. But it was hard work. I think they were just beginning in the late 30s to think about more expansion. In fact, what was built of Forsyth was the first attempt at that.
Hi. Gill, one of the features of Newnham that I've always valued was to some extent, its non-conformity, the establishment, the role that Henry Sidgwick played in its establishment, the fact that there was never a college chapel here. And it's led me, I think it's led to a free thinking, if you like, within Newnham, which has been, I think, of an enormous value. I wonder whether you would agree with that.
Very much so. It is one, if not the most powerful bond, it is one of the most powerful bonds between Anne Jemima Clough and Henry Sidgwick, was their determination that it should be a non-denominational institution. Henry's own loss of faith had mirrored that of Anne Jemima's brother, yes, Arthur Hugh, the poet. And in fact, it was on the basis of reading about that Henry asked a mutual friend if he could meet the Clough family. And while Anne Jemima was herself a believer, she was appalled at the way her brother was treated. And they were absolutely certain that any institution, any creation of theirs, would not be a denominational institution, that they would proclaim tolerance as a positive virtue. And that, I think, has been hugely important. And they were prepared to turn down donations that came with denominational strings attached. Didn't mean that if you wished to attend a place of worship, you were not encouraged to do so. If you didn't wish, up to the age of 21, Anne Jemima felt more comfortable if she had a letter from your parents. After the age of 21, you could do what you like. And of course, Blanche Athena, if she had any faith, she'd lost it by the age of 12. So she was actually very good to entertain your visitors on a Sunday morning. But the tolerance as a positive virtue, which I think we too easily lose sight of, certainly in the contemporary society, is an enormously important value of the college. Yes. And of course, positively heretical in the Cambridge of its day.
Thank you so much. You speak about women lecturers deciding to wear hats while they were lecturing. It was really exciting being here and watching some of the graduation happening, and it made me recall about, were there rules about what women from the college here are expected to wear for graduation? I noticed some of the women in trousers, and I don't think that was around when I was here. Could you remind us about that, please? Dress for graduation.
Well, once full membership was achieved, then for graduation it had to be sub-fusk. Allowing women members of the university to wear trousers was a product of the Great Freeze of the winter of 1962-3, which mercifully declared that women could wear trousers, and that has never been rescinded. So it is possible to conform with academic dress with black trousers.
But what about the graduation itself?
Yeah. The bigger problem, I don't know, have we got a praelector here? It's not a job I've ever done. But my memories as a director of studies was that the bigger problem was coloured hair. Lucy is nodding her head vigorously. I mean, do you remember from your own graduation?
Yeah, I think it's normally coloured hair and painted nails.
Painted nails, so that way. Right. Though one of my old students who had had purple hair for her entire career got away with it. How we managed it, I do not know. In fact, I don't think I want to know. But behind you, Lucy, is Felicity, isn't it?
Marion here. What do you think were the biggest challenges, not of starting the college, but of the continuation for the kind of 50 to 100 mark? So 50 to 150 mark, maybe.
I think this sense of being stuck on the threshold, knowing that in terms of scholarship, quality of students, the college could deliver, and financially all colleges were more constrained between the wars and with the shifts, the demographic shifts. The population was dwindling slightly. And against this set, the sense in the public prints, I mean, you know, there had been the Sex Disqualification Removal Act in 1919, which had allowed women into more occupations. And a really quite fractious student body at various points, wondering why on earth they were still being stopped from doing various things. I mean, chaperonage remains on the books until the late 1930s. Extraordinarily, I mean, increasingly, I think, more honoured in the breach than in the observance, but the rules were there. And if you go back to the minutes of the Joint Committee of Fellows and Students, which dates from 1919, I mean, you know, one of the things that marks out this college is that there have always been extended relations between senior and junior members, not with the formality that there is still in many of the erstwhile men's colleges. So and there are students on the governing body, on council. You go back to those minutes, the temper of the minutes changes, and the junior members are chafing. They look at the society around them. They see various sorts of freedoms, though actually not trousers till the Second World War, unlike the United States. But, and why can't we have more of that? And the women academics, knowing all too well that anything will be seized on by the tabloid, or the equivalent of the tabloid press, and they will have to deal with this kind of backlash. It's in some ways it's not a very happy period.
I'll just talk loudly. As more and more men's colleges went mixed, what was the impact on Newnham?
pressure of numbers in terms of applications was reduced, which frankly was a relief. In a situation where you have 9 candidates for every place. So that was significant. There were discussions as to what the implications were in terms of senior member appointments at Newnham, and I've been, in my time, been party to at least 3 of those, if not more. But I think one of the things which we owe to those early considerations and the sense that the women's colleges were delighted to welcome more women to Cambridge. Admissions was handled initially by what was known as the old Group 4, set up in 3 months by one of our honorary fellows, Professor Jane Brown, and awareness of the importance of ensuring that good applicants, their primary consideration was coming to Cambridge rather than a particular college, is what has fed into the university-wide pool for candidates, which is very different from the arrangements working in Oxford, where there are little cabals, frankly, whereas there is a proper university-wide pool. And that, I think, is rooted in the early preparedness of the women's colleges, not to say we're going to retreat into our own ghetto, but let's see if we can make this work for the wider population. So there is a lot more detail, and of course, each governing body is sovereign, so no doubt the issues will be discussed again and again.
Your final remark, however, sort of indicated that to some extent that period is over. Newnham is now cool. I mean, are we getting more first applications as distinct from taking applicants from the pool?
Well, you need to look at Sam Lucy's tables in the roll letter, and they suggest that we are getting a decent number and a decent quality. Having said that, then we also get very good candidates from the pool. And part of the work of the admissions office, and Lucy is more current with this than I am, is to convince people admitted from the pool that they aren't second-class citizens. And certainly in my days as director of studies, I relied on a group of colleagues who would say, look, the admissions tutor stopped me taking X, but I think you should look at her seriously. And that, so far as I'm aware, still goes on. But Lucy, can you add?
Sorry, what was that?
Well, can you add to the amount of effort that goes into persuading people who are admitted from the pool that they are not stamped through and through with second class?
Yeah, that's still an issue. I think, like you say, I think Newnham is cool now. So I definitely, over the last few years, when I've had conversations with prospective students, I think they're happy to be here however they got here. I don't know if that was the case before I arrived, but I do definitely think the opening of this new building has been really important in kind of changing the image a little bit of Newnham. And I would say that when you mention that you go to Newnham, or you mention that you're based at Newnham, people go, ooh, which is really nice. People are always quite excited to hear that they have a contact at Newnham. In terms of admissions, I think, yeah, the popularity of Newnham is really interesting. used to work in admissions and do lots of tours around the college, and it really sells itself, actually. You take people around, there's a lot of interest on the open days. People are really keen to see Newnham. I think we get a lot of people through the doors on the open days, which is always a really good sign. So yeah, I definitely agree that Newnham is cool now. I think it always was, but... Can I ask one final question?
Yes.
So the impact of pre-university education on the students. So obviously towards the beginning of the period you were talking about, women wouldn't have been to school and then they started going to school. And how did that affect their experience once they came to Newnham?
Yes, I should have made, in addition to talking about tolerance as a positive virtue, I should also have made the point that Newnham, really up to 1914, was extraordinarily relaxed about you came and you did as much as you could. Girton from the beginning said you had to do a tripos in exactly the same terms as men in the same time period. And the fallout, because so few of those women had had any formal education of any kind, fallout in the first years was terrible. Newnham took a wholly different view, and that also was somewhat unusual. It gradually fades. I think by the end of the First World War, the populations of women students were looking pretty similar, and most had had some sort of formal education. It did mean they knew what to do with an examination paper, because you get miserable accounts in the very first years, because some of them didn't know what to do, put in that kind of situation. More generally, I don't get the sense that there is a lot of change in the way the women behave. I mean, they're pre-1914, they're a pretty determined bunch, and they can see how this is going to pay off in their careers, because a sizable proportion of them go on to paid employment. So they're a bunch of toughies, but then they're a bunch of toughies from 1919 on.
Amazing. Unless we have any more questions, I think we'll wrap up and we will head to the Porter's Lodge. So if anyone wants to come and get any books signed, follow us there, I think.